I find that this discussion interesting, both from the last panel and this panel, because to me it seems like there's two sorts of mixed income pieces. There's the place-based mixed income. So you're talking about the units, the buildings themselves, and actually mixing the incomes in the buildings themselves. But you also talked about the voucher programs. And we see that in Chicago, you see that in Dallas, moving to opportunity. Do you see different results when you're income mixing in a project in a place versus when you see the income mixing happen throughout counties or throughout neighborhoods through the voucher program?
So you're right that there is, I think, a lot of the policy has tried to focus on this people-based versus place-based approach. And we do see some differences. But the question, I think, is sort of why are we seeing those differences? And I think that part is not quite so clear. So certainly with the Moving to Opportunity program, with this voucher-based approach, we saw some noticeable differences, which I'll discuss, which are different from the regular operation of the voucher program. So in the traditional vouchers, households receive this voucher which they can use to rent on the private market, but there are no requirements other than the rent limit in terms of what neighborhoods they choose. With Moving to Opportunity, this was a randomized controlled trial where public housing residents were given vouchers that could only be used in these low poverty neighborhoods, less than 10%. In the short term, there was actually very promising results in terms of things like mental health and some aspects of physical health, specifically around obesity and high blood pressure. Women in particular, young women, reported much better outcomes in terms of mental health. But young men actually, we saw increases in risky behavior. There were also no impacts on employment or education. Now, this was very startling for a lot of researchers and policy, and policy officials, because the primary motive behind this was to encourage households to become quote unquote self-sufficient and to find jobs or to find training. Later research, which re-examined those outcomes nearly 20 years later, actually found positive benefits for younger children in terms of college enrollment. Okay? So we see some benefits that accrue much later over time, but they were not the kinds that were initially expected. But I want to point out that it's not to say that we couldn't achieve those same gains through what's called a project-based approach. It's important to think about that neighborhood context, and I think that's the point.
Okay. Other questions?
Thank you both. I actually just have a comment following up on that, because I was also thinking about the place-based versus mobility approaches. And for the chart that you made with the goals and challenges, it seemed like they were mixed in, like what happens to the residents and what happens to the neighborhood. And I would just be interested if those were pulled apart and built out. They seem like different, you could learn different things about the actual type of policy that's being implemented if you were just looking at what's actually happening to the neighborhood when these moves occur versus what's happening to the people.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Joni. I think that I think you're right that we could look at those people and place-based benefits or implications or consequences separately. I think one of the challenges is that the residents are going to influence the neighborhood context and vice versa. And so what I'm trying to do is, in some ways, by keeping those together, is to dissolve some of that distinction between the mobility-based and the place-based approach. Because in some senses, a mobility-based approach like vouchers is going to depend on the place context in which they can live and in which they can find housing that landlords will approve of. The place-based approach of mixed income housing redevelopment requires households to move because they're often displaced in the beginning context, or higher income households are moving in. So there's also a people-based component to it. So in my thinking, I think that the people-based and the mobility-based and the place-based approach is a convention that's useful for policy discussions, but may not be useful in terms of thinking about outcomes.
We had a question here, Martina. And then here.
Thank you. Question for Crystal, to mix it up a little bit. And I have a very specific question. You talked about the development-sponsored affordable housing program in Edmonton, which delivered 30-ish units. So not zero,
The
but close
portfolio
to.
did grow in value by 25%, however.
Excellent, excellent. You mentioned the legal authority, or the lack of, impacted your ability to deliver. Can you just maybe tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. So, as I mentioned, like we had experimented in the 70s with a land dedication policy that was ultimately overturned by the courts. And in the context of that, I think, but then also in the context of at the time we had a mayor who was, ultimately came from the development industry and was really determined that industry plays some kind of a role in the affordable housing crisis that we were seeing. And so he really is the one who drove the creation of this program. And so I think the city lawyers were pretty reticent to do anything because we didn't feel like we had the legal authority under the Municipal Government Act because we don't have inclusionary housing powers. At the time, we didn't. So basically what the lawyers decided is that because we have negotiated zones, like direct control zones, we could always negotiate for that option first, and that's how we would attain that outcome. So it's kind of like, municipalities can do density bonusing in exchange for certain things, but it can be anything, and a lot of times it's like a negotiation, right? This was sort of just setting a city policy that said one of the things that we would negotiate for anytime we had an ability to negotiate would be that option to purchase. Does that make sense? What we have now under the city charter, though, is it effectively just says, as long as we put the rules in the zoning bylaw, and the rules speak to what, if any, offsets will be provided in exchange for units, we can have the units anywhere. So.
Okay. We have one question here.
My question regarding the mobility, like moving study, do you think it depends on the location? Like in Chicago, it's totally different than Calgary, totally different than Toronto, or does it matter?
Can I add one little thing? I'll just add one little comment on that because we have had a little bit of experience with this in Edmonton, and I've thought a lot about this because, so with these surplus school sites, often, and we did 40 in the early 2000s, but there was a round of them in the 80s as well. And I actually grew up across the street from like a co-op housing development that was in a otherwise sort of large lot, move up kind of neighborhood. And so I think that's my personal lens on it. But anyways, I think there are different impacts, and I have beyond just anecdotal data, because I mean, obviously, like I went to school with those kids, we took the bus together, we were friends, like whatever. But in terms of actual empirical evidence, we did evaluate our First Place program, which is a first-time homebuyers program that went on to 20 of those sites very recently, and we surveyed neighborhood residents and people living in the first-time homebuyer homes. And a lot of these sites were super controversial when we started them. And one of the interesting things that we found is that the residents living in those first-time homebuyers homes reported very high levels of social integration from their perspective. So like, I think it was like 72% or so felt that they were very well socially integrated into those neighborhoods. But what was interesting is that the surrounding residents that weren't in those homes, like just the existing community members, they reported much lower results around social integration. So I think I would just say that's a Canadian context, but maybe we're polite and they don't see or maybe Canadians are polite, or I don't know what it is, but for whatever reason, although people in the surrounding area may not welcome those developments or the people living in them, the people living in them don't feel unwelcome, if that makes sense.
Yeah. In thinking about sort of between cities versus within cities, the research suggests that there's far more variation and heterogeneity within cities than there are between cities in terms of these social outcomes. So there's some work that's been done by Raj Chetty and Nathaniel Hendren, using tax data in the United States, showing that neighborhoods that are just a mile apart can have tremendous differences in terms of 30 years later on household income, marriage, crime, et cetera, et cetera. And these are just neighborhoods within a city itself. So I don't think it's a Chicago versus Calgary context. I think it's figuring out which neighborhoods and what aspects of those neighborhoods might be working for households.
Okay, so one last question from the floor over there.
Hi, this is Claire from Calgary Housing. So this question is for Crystal about the 17% non-market housing target. I was just curious to know whether you guys have reached that target in any of your communities, and also whether the question has come up as to whether there should be a maximum percentage of non-market housing and what that would be. So for just to start, I would say the city doesn't position it as a maximum. We position it as a minimum or like an aspirational goal for every neighborhood. Although I would say some residents in neighborhoods would position it as a maximum for sure. We have exceeded that target in a number of neighborhoods. I think probably about 20 or so have more than that. And it's really interesting because I mean, some neighborhoods you can't tell by looking at any of the neighborhoods. Like it's very contextual. So one of our inner city neighborhoods has 30% affordable housing or subsidized housing. That's Macaulay, and that's one of the neighborhoods that was really leading the charge on this non-market affordable housing pause. But then one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in Edmonton has over 30%, is Strathern, which is like a neighborhood overlooking the river valley, but it has a huge subsidized seniors development in there. And so I think that target is in the eye of the beholder. Like Strathern, I don't think would say that it feels, like it needs a threshold and it can't take any more necessarily, but Macaulay definitely feels that way. So it's sort of subjective, but again, just from the city perspective, we don't say it's a maximum, we say it's a minimum.
Okay, so thank you very much to our panelists. Before we give them a round of applause, I'd like to ask an audience participation question. So, who do you think is going to be first to use their inclusionary housing powers? Is it going to be Calgary or is it going to be Edmonton? So, if you think it's going to be... you think they're going to get repealed?
I think the challenge is there's a couple so we're taking a report in January and we'll see what council says about that. But some of the practical realities where I think Toronto and Vancouver might look at us like we're crazy for not jumping all over this is like Edmonton at least, and I think it's probably similar in Calgary, we've given away a lot of our density. Like we've proactively upzoned everything in our downturns. And so there isn't a lot to negotiate with in terms of just acquiring units. Also, right now in Edmonton, there's no new condos really being built because the price for land for condo that could be used for condos is actually no longer connected to the actual demand for condos. It's priced way too high, and part of that is because of I think planning approval process a little bit, and other factors. So there are some economic challenges with trying to implement it in a really effective way, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a creative or middle of the road sort of way that we could look at that's more pegged to the current economic environment that we're looking at.